Okay, welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing domain and range in a different type of way when we're dealing with a graph that has connecting points. So up until this point, we've had points on a graph such as, say, 2 comma 2, or let's say negative 4 comma 0. Let's say, I don't know, negative 4, negative 3. Right? So we've had points on a graph that look like that. Okay, now if I ask you for the domain and range of those points, simply all you're going to tell me is that your domain is all your x values, your range is all your y values. So in this case, all of my range values, all my domain values are my x value there is negative 4, positive 2, negative 4. So my domain would simply be negative 4 and 2, right? I don't have to state negative 4 twice. Now my range values would be, let's say my y values are here at 0, 2, and negative 3. 0, 2, negative 3. Okay, those are my range values. You could put it in order or you could just leave it like that. Okay, so now that is if we just have isolated points. Okay, now as soon as I connect that point to that point, that point to that point, or that point to that point, okay, now I have additional values that are added to my domain and added to my range. So all of my domain values are every x value that could be stated on this illustration on this graph. So let's say, okay, what about that point right there? Okay, that point right there is 1 comma 1. Okay, or how about that point right there? That looks about 0 comma 1 and a half. Okay, so you could keep going on and on and on. All these points on this graph have an x and a y value. So it will be hard to list like we have them up there. So what we're going to talk about today is writing these domain and ranges using inequalities. So if I had a graph like number 1, okay, if you see that it has one endpoint right there and it travels and it has an arrow on the other side. Okay, example 2 has an endpoint and a second endpoint. And 3 has an endpoint followed by an arrow. Okay, so these are going to be different types of graphs that we're going to write domain and range inequalities to represent a range of values that are part of my domain and part of my range. So I'm going to start with this. If I have one endpoint, usually it's going to be a simple inequality. For example, I would say like all my x values that are less than 4. All right, that's a simple inequality as one inequality. So I'm talking about all my x values that are less than 4. If you have 2 or more endpoints, okay, it's going to be a compound inequality. Just going to abbreviate inequality. So that would look like, let's say, negative 3 is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to 4. Okay, so 2 or more, I'm going to have 2 inequalities. Okay, simple, I'm going to have one inequality. Okay, now, these are dealing with the domain because I'm dealing with x. If I was dealing with range, all I'm going to do is replace that with a y and replace that x with a y. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of examples. Now, if you don't have a highlighter, if you could go grab a highlighter right now, pause the video, that would be great. Okay, good. So now, when we deal with a graph like number 1 and it has a domain, I am going to first look at my graph and see if it has one endpoint or two endpoints. Right now, it has one. So it's going to be a simple inequality. So it's just going to be x is either less than or equal to or greater than or equal to a number. So I'm going to just draw my x. Okay. Now grab a highlighter. Okay, now how far left does your graph go? Now if I travel here, this is going to keep going on and on and on because that's arrow. Keeps going on and on and on. So it never stops going to the left. That's important. Now if you travel right, when does your graph stop? It stops at that endpoint right there. So if you just want to draw a vertical highlighted line like that. Good. So now I'm talking about what value? I'm talking about all my x values. So on this graph, I'm talking about all my x values that are where of 5. All my x values that are less than 5 to the left or greater than 5 to the right. In this case, my graph is to the left, so I'm talking about less than. So I'm going to draw a less than symbol, and then my value of 5. Okay, now before you're finished with the domain here, you just want to look at that endpoint. Is it closed or is it open? It's closed, so that means that 5 is part of my domain, so I have to close it with the underline under the inequality. Good. So now let's talk about range. Okay, it has one endpoint, so it's just going to be a simple inequality, so I'm just going to draw y. Now it's going to be y is greater than or equal to or less than or equal to a number. Same thing, always start down. Okay, start down first. So how far down does your graph go? My graph keeps going on and on and on and on and on forever. It doesn't have a restriction down below. But what it does have a restriction is up top. If you go high, 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 all the way up here, okay, and it stops at that value of the y, which is 2. All right, you see how that just stops at 2 vertically? So what you're going to do is say, okay, all my values, y values, that are less than 2 or greater than 2. Where's my graph? It's below, so it's going to be less than 2. Finally, once I go back, I just have to make sure if it's going to be less than or equal to, and since it's closed, 2 is part of my range. Okay? Now, just to recap, when we talk about domain, I'm talking about right and left. When I talk about range, I'm talking about up and down. So you're talking about how far right your graph goes and how far, my directions are backwards. My apologies. So you're talking about how far left your graph goes and how far right your graph goes and how far up your graph goes and how far down your graph goes. My apologies. Okay, let me do one more example, and the third one's going to be a money problem. So here, now let's look at my domain. Okay, my domain is how far left and how far right. So the first thing I'm going to say is, do I have 1 or 2 endpoints? I have 2. And this is important. When I have 2 endpoints for a graph, it's always going to be, for my domain, it's x. Then it's always going to be a less than to the left and a less than to the right. So I'm talking about numbers between 2 numbers. Okay, so good. So now I'm going to grab my highlighter. I'm going to say, okay, how far left does my graph go? My graph goes here to the left, which is the value of -5. Okay, so simply all I'm going to do is write that value to the left of my inequality, which is -5. How far right does your graph go? My graph goes all the way right here, and you're talking about x, you're not talking about y. So you have to go on the x-axis. Where is it? It's at -2. So that's going to be my right restraint. Good. Okay, so that's my inequality. Now the last thing I have to do is go to the endpoint. Go to the endpoint by -5. Is it open or closed? It's open, so I'm going to leave that inequality because -5 is not included. Go all the way right to -2. That's open, so -2 is not part of my domain. I'm done. Good. Now same thing with y. If I have two endpoints, I'm going to have y in the middle, and I'm going to have a less than to the left and a less than to the right. Good. Grab my highlighter. Okay, now I'm going to go down first, because when you have a compound inequality, remember always your lower number goes on the left, your greater number goes on the right. So my graph goes all the way down there, which is that point right there. So where is that hit on the y-axis, which is -4. So that value of -4 is going to go on the left, like such, and then you're going to go to your upper restraint. How high does my graph go? And it's right there on the y-axis, which is +4. It's going to be +4. Awesome. Before I'm done, I'm just going to go to my two restraints. Now, the first one was my lower one, so it's right here. Is that an open or closed circle? It's open, so I'm going to leave that inequality. Go to my upper restraint, which is +4. That's open, so I'm going to leave it. Okay, awesome. So now, number 3 is going to be a money problem. If you want to rewatch the video or ask questions, please do. See you next time.